Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Chantal Doris, and I'm the chairman of the Bar of England and Wales, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight, and to welcome you to this debate. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union, or should the United Kingdom leave the European Union? And we're delighted to be co-hosting this event with Lincoln's Inn EU Law Group this evening. And dare I say it, I suspect that the numbers of you here tonight reflect the fact that there is genuine and real interest in this question, one that many of us will be voting on in less than 10 days, and one which may be one of the most important questions of our generation. Now, I have four very distinguished guests on the platform with me tonight, and I'm going to start by introducing them to you, although I'm sure that's probably not necessary, and I'm going to do so in the order in which they will be speaking tonight. The first of the speakers is Dominic Grieve, QC MP, who since 1997 has been the Member of Parliament for Beaconsfield. He was Attorney General for over 4 years until 2014 during the recent coalition government. And among his current Select Committee appointments, he is Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. Second, Michael Howard QC, Lord Howard, who represented Folkestone and Hythe constituency for 27 years before joining the House of Lords in 2010. He's a former leader of the Conservative Party and a leader of the opposition during the Blair administration. He served in Cabinet under Prime Minister John Major as Home Secretary, Environment Secretary, and Employment Secretary. Thirdly, Joanna Cherry, QC MP, who practiced as a Scottish advocate for some 20 years, was elected to Parliament in May last year to represent Edinburgh's South West and is a long-term supporter of independence and Home Rule for Scotland. She is the Shadow SNP Westminster Group leader covering justice and home affairs. And our fourth speaker, Martin Howe QC, whose practice covers intellectual property law, EU law, commercial and public law. He regularly appears before the European Court of Justice and was a member of the coalition government's Commission on a Bill of Rights for the UK. He is chairman of Lawyers for Britain, a campaigning group of lawyers who support fundamental change in relations with the EU and who support a vote to leave the EU. Now, before I call on each of these speakers, a few words about the format of tonight's debate. I'm going to invite each speaker to address you for 6 minutes, and then assuming time is kept around 7 o'clock, I'm going to open the debate to the floor, and I'm going to ask you to ask the speakers questions. And we'll close this around 7:45, and I will then ask each of the speakers to make a short closing statement of not more than 2 minutes. I will then put the question to a vote, and you should each have on your chair an in and an out vote, and I will ask you to vote with those. And I will then announce the result over drinks, which will follow on from the debate. Now, I'm told that for those of you who are tweeters, hashtag EUREF are the important words, or is the important hashtag. So without further ado, I'm going to open tonight's debate and ask Dominic Grieve to argue why the UK should remain as a member of the EU.
Thank you very much for asking me to participate tonight in this debate on what it seems to me is likely to be the single most important choice that most of us are going to have to make in our lifetimes. As Attorney General from 2010 to 2014, I had plenty of opportunities to see how the EU worked and its impact on our country. Its institutions exist to give effect to a series of treaties by which its 28 member states agree to create a single market in goods and services and to cooperate in other fields, including environmental protection, health and safety, social policy, security and policing. And the United Kingdom enjoys a unique status within the EU because we are not party to some aspects of its treaties. But as I often discovered, legal interpretation of the treaties can be complex. And as a consequence, I certainly didn't always get my own way if I appeared in front of the European Court of Justice, and nor did we always get our own way in our arguments with the Commission. And in addition, while we enjoyed a veto over key areas of the treaties, some are done by qualified majority voting, and there again, sometimes decisions are taken despite our dissent. So I certainly had ample opportunity to share in frustrations as to how the EU worked. But none of those criticisms persuade me that we would be better off leaving. By virtue of joining up in 1973, we opened a period of progressive national economic revival that took us from being a sick man in Europe right through a period of remarkable economic development and growth. And indeed, a lot of that is due to our trade with Europe. 45% of all our exports, and above all, our trade in services, which is so important as it takes up 75% of everything which we are selling abroad. We've also enjoyed a massive growth in prosperity based on inward investment. I represent a constituency where the pharmaceutical sector is very considerable. The businesses that have come into my constituency from outside of Europe are all there because of the possibility of market access into the EU, into a single market, not some World Trade Organization relationship. The City of London has also benefited in exactly the same way. So has our automotive industry. One of the key questions is whether that £24 billion of annual investment, which we are currently getting from this means, is going to continue if we leave. And I also take the view that the EU's negotiating power to conclude free trade agreements with other countries has proved to be valuable. We keep on being told that we would do better on our own, but the world is, in some ways, an increasingly protectionist place at present, and actually breaking into foreign markets, we have the advantage of having a market of our own of 500 million to do that negotiation. I'm also quite satisfied from my experience as Attorney General and my work as Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee that the EU is of immense value to us in relation to our national security. Let's be quite clear about this. Those who argue that NATO is the underpinning of our military defence are absolutely right. But I have to say to you that increasingly the cooperation in terms of fighting terrorism is done through EU mechanisms. And as I see constantly in my current role, that aspect is growing and developing more and more and is of increasing value to us. And that's why Sir John Searle and Lord Evans both said, as past heads of the security, two of our agencies, how important that relationship was. And I have heard nothing to persuade me from the Brexiters that we would be better off out. What is the relationship that we are going to have with the EU? World Trade Organization relationship, but somehow with a few douceurs provided to the United Kingdom. In view of what we are about to unleash on our European partners, I find that idea rather fanciful. I also don't really understand the argument on immigration. I know that there is a serious global migration crisis. But if the economy is going to develop in the way that Brexiters say it's going to when we leave, who is going to do the jobs? Currently, 50,000 jobs in our NHS are being done by European nationals. If our economy expands, as they say, more jobs will need to be filled, and Europeans who are coming to do it very well and in a very simple and straightforward mechanism for both coming here and going home when their work is often finished. And I worry too about the me of this current debate. Of course our national interest comes first, but our national interest is also intimately linked to the national interest of our nearest neighbours who are our partners. We live in a difficult and dangerous world. You only have to look from my role in the Intelligence and Security Committee to what's going on in the Middle East and Russia to see that there is an arc of disturbance and chaos surrounding us. Is this the right moment to turn our back on neighbours and partners who, even if they have distinctively different cultures, nevertheless share our core values and with whom we have cooperated closely for over half a century to improve the quality of life of our citizens and to ensure that there is peace? That seems to me, at the end of the day, to be the fundamental issue. And our cooperation with them is absolutely normal and in keeping with our national tradition. Since 1834, we've signed up to over 13,200 treaties, even at the height of our imperial power. Each one of them involves some sharing of sovereignty, and the EU is no different. We entered into them as a sovereign nation because they were in our national interest to do it. And that willingness to engage internationally is at the heart of our success as a nation. We should be building on it and not throwing all that we have so successfully achieved to date away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. Lord Howard.
Let me begin by responding to what Dominic said about the economy. It's true, we're a much more prosperous country now than we were in 1973. I believe that that owes infinitely more to the economic revolution which this country underwent when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister than it does to our membership of the European Union. Indeed, our membership, our trade with the European Union has declined over that period of time from 55% of our trade to 45%. But I don't want to lay too much emphasis on economics because, as the great American economist J.K. Galbraith famously said, the only reason economic forecasting was invented was to make astrology look respectable. And as Ashoka Modi, a former senior official of the IMF, has said, the official consensus on the economic costs of Brexit has crossed the line to groupthink. A numerical illusion is masquerading as a fact, and when those in authority distort facts, they also subvert the cause of democracy. And it's democracy that I want to talk about this evening. Of the many gifts that our country has given the world, by far the greatest is the gift of self-governing democracy. And at the heart of that democracy is a connection between the votes people cast at general elections, the government they elect, and the accountability which derives from their ability to turf that government out. That's the system which has evolved over the centuries for giving the British people the control over their destiny, which those who came before us argued for, fought for, and died for. But if a government, having made its promises to the electors, is unable to keep those promises not as a result of any conscious decisions on its part, but as a result of the decision of some entirely extraneous, unaccountable body, such as the unelected European Commission or the unaccountable European Court of Justice, that crucial connection is broken. The lever of control just doesn't work, and our democracy is undermined and subverted. Now, democracy and sovereignty can sometimes seem rather abstract concepts. So let me give you three specific examples of what I mean. First, we have a government that was twice elected in part on a promise to reduce immigration into our country to tens of thousands. It's incapable of fulfilling that promise because it has no control over immigration from the European Union. Now, I'm a bit of a maverick on this question because, in my view, this referendum shouldn't be about and isn't about the level of immigration into our country. But what it is and should be about is who decides the level of immigration into our country. There are those who think the current level is fine and indeed necessary for our economic growth. Others take a different view. It's an issue which we should be capable of arguing out and deciding in this United Kingdom. And at the moment, we can't do that. We can't do it as long as we remain members of the European Union. And let me give two more examples, both relating to the European Court of Justice, which Dominic described very recently as a predatory court, often reaching decisions inimical to our interests. The Home Secretary of the United Kingdom has always had the power to refuse entry to someone whose presence was not conducive to the public good. And in 2005, Charles Clarke, Home Secretary at the time, refused entry to a French national, someone who had joint Algerian-French citizenship, whom we knew was involved in terrorism. The European Court of Justice overruled him, and their word is law. As you know, their decision is final. So we had to let that terrorist into our country, and countless other terrorists since who've relied on that decision. So much for making our country safe. And more astonishingly still, part of an act of Parliament, the Data Protection and Regulatory Powers Act of 2014, was struck down by the Divisional Court and is currently before the European Court of Justice, which will decide whether that Act of Parliament, passed by both our houses after long debate, is consistent with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, an act which incidentally was described by the Home Secretary as crucial to fighting crime, protecting children, and combating terrorism. Oh, and by the way, the ECJ isn't going to announce its decision until after June the 23rd. There was a pledge in the Queen's speech a few weeks ago to uphold the sovereignty of Parliament and the primacy of the House of Commons. Those words are not worth the paper they're written on as long as we remain members of the European Union. I want to end by referring to President Obama, who was kind enough to visit us a few weeks ago to give us some advice. I was very frustrated that no one, while he was here, asked him the following question. If, in the current presidential election, a candidate suggested that the United States Supreme Court should be subordinate to a North American Court of Justice sitting in Mexico City, and that the United States Congress should be subordinate to an unelected North American commission sitting in Ottawa, and that the United States government should give up its control over who could come into the country and who couldn't, how long would he think such a candidate would last? I think we all know the answer to that question. We have a long and illustrious tradition of democratic self-government in this country. We are as entitled to govern ourselves as are the people of the United States of America. And we can only recover our birthright and our heritage by voting to leave on June the 23rd.
Thank you, Lord Howard. Joanna Cherry, seconding the motion to stay in the EU.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here this evening. It's the second time in the space of a week that I've experienced hospitality from the English bar, and I must say I'm getting rather used to it. Last week, my debating partner was kind enough to invite me to a Middle Temple guest night, where I enjoyed a very pleasant evening. And tonight I'm very pleased to be joining him in arguing the case for the United Kingdom remaining in the European Union. It's the first time I have ever shared a platform with a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It's not something, with all due respect to Dominic, I intend to make a habit of, and I'm hoping it won't damage the SNP in the way that sharing a platform with the Tories damaged the Scottish Labour Party in the Scottish referendum. However, I'm very happy to share this platform with Dominic tonight, given the importance that I and my party place on continued membership of the European Union. Of course, I would like to see an independent Scotland, but for so long as the majority of people living in Scotland wish to remain part of the United Kingdom, then I will argue passionately for the United Kingdom to remain part of Europe. The European Union is made up of a number of independent states. I'd like to see Scotland be one of those eventually, but I would also like to see England, our closest and sometimes dearest neighbour, also be an independent member of the European Union. As I see it, ladies and gentlemen, there are three key advantages of the European Union. The first is peace, the fact it's brought us peace for over 60 years. Now, I know there have been wars in Europe over the last 60 years, but none of them have been between the member states of the European Union. The second advantage is the single market. The EU single market of over 500 million people has brought considerable benefits to the British economy. And the third advantage is the fact that the EU guarantees and enhances many of the social and economic rights which we enjoy today. Dominic's dealt admirably with the peace and security issues and the economy, And I'd like to focus on the social and economic rights aspect. But first of all, I want to take Lord Howard to task on his allegation that the EU is not democratic. We hear this all the time, the European Union is not democratic, and we hear opprobrium heaped upon the Commission because the Commission is not elected. But ladies and gentlemen, the Commission is the civil service of the European Union. The civil service in the United Kingdom isn't elected. The Commission is made up of commissioners appointed by the member states. It proposes laws, but it's the Council of Ministers made up of ministers from the democratically elected member states of the Union that make the laws in conjunction with the Parliament, which is made up of directly elected members. Now, I know that this democracy in the European Union is not perfect, but really we have many issues in our own democracy in the United Kingdom. We don't have proportional representation. The current Conservative government only has 37% of the vote and 24% of the electorate. I can stand here and be very self-righteous about that because the Scottish government has 46.5% of the vote. But I'm not here to score points for the SNP tonight. So I challenge whether the European Union is terribly undemocratic as opposed to Britain. We also have a House of Lords in Britain with over 800 peers who are unelected and unaccountable to the public. There are many people in the House of Lords who are very talented and bring something to legislation. I'm not saying we should get rid of all of them, but we should have a second chamber that's democratically elected. So while we're looking at the democratic deficit in the European Union, let's not forget there's also a democratic deficit in the United Kingdom. But moving back to the issue of socio-economic rights. Gender equality is something that's at the heart of the European Union, and perhaps some of the European Union's greatest achievements in the field of socio-economic rights has been in the field of gender equality and employment rights. And if you're interested, the Trade Unions Council published a report last month showing 20 key gains for women workers in the United Kingdom as a result of European Union membership. Now, we often hear that many of these gains would have happened anyway, but I question whether that's true. Take equal pay, for example. We all know that equal pay was made in Dagenham, made in the United Kingdom, but it wasn't until women got the right to equal pay for work of equal value that that right really became meaningful. And that right came into force as a result of the dreaded Court of Justice, when the Commission took a Conservative government in the United Kingdom to court and it was forced to implement equal pay for work of equal value. As a result, hundreds of thousands of women have been able to implement meaningful claims, cleaners comparing themselves with dustbin men and the like in local authorities. Maternity rights are another good example of the importance of EU law. It's true that we had maternity leave before the EU, and it's true that UK rights in terms of length of maternity leave are longer than the EU minimum. But EU law has also resulted in a much wider set of maternity rights emanating from the EU Pregnant Workers Directive of 1993 and another EU directive in 2011. And in the bad old days, ladies and gentlemen, English judges ruled that dismissing a woman because of pregnancy was not sex discrimination because an employer would have dismissed a sick man in similar circumstances. It was the European Court of Justice that put an end to that nonsense. Now, you might think it's unlikely that we will lose these rights if there is a Brexit, but I would ask you to consider those who say they want to cut back such rights in the interest of cutting back red tape. It's not fanciful, because Steve Hilton, the Prime Minister's friend and former advisor who supports a Brexit, said back in 2011 that maternity leave should be abolished. So at the very least, in the event of a Brexit, it's likely that these socio-economic rights could be narrowed and could also be made less effective by slashing compensation and putting more barriers in the way of access to justice. So there is an alternative argument for staying in the EU. It's not perfect. It needs reform. Next year, if we stay in, the United Kingdom is set to host the EU Council presidency. What better opportunity for us to lead the European Union in reform rather than to turn our back on it? Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote to remain in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Joanna Cherry. And I hand over to our final speaker supporting the leaving of Europe, Martin Howe, QC.
Leaving of the European Union. I don't think anyone tonight is proposing that we leave Europe. A confusion that is often made deliberately or accidentally by those who want to remain a member of that institution. Now, Michael Howard has already emphasised that we pay a very heavy price for being in the European Union. That price is that we have lost the right to decide the laws that govern us over a wide and ever-increasing range of areas. Democracy means that as citizens we can vote for our elected representatives and that we can vote them out and replace them if we don't like the laws they make. But with EU law, we have lost that right. We do not have that power. Its system of making or changing laws is labyrinthine and totally unaccountable. Now, Joanna Cherry described it with masterly understatement as not perfect. The European system of lawmaking is completely opaque and unaccountable. How can a voter who is against a particular law or proposal within that labyrinthine European system ever make his or her views felt? And apart from the process of making laws, of course, we have laws that are made not by politicians but by judges, based on supposedly interpreting treaties and instruments, in practice extending them and creating new law in ways that are completely unchallengeable. Now that price is heavy, but have the British people ever agreed to pay that price? I'd like to just look at what the official government pamphlet said at the time of the 1975 referendum. And it was entitled, Britain's New Deal in Europe. It sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? And it talked about parliamentary sovereignty. Will Parliament lose its power? What are the facts? Fact. No important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British government and a British Parliament. It is the Council of Ministers and not the market's officials who take the important decisions. These decisions can be taken only if all the members of the Council agree. The minister representing Britain can veto any proposal for a new law or a new tax if he considers it to be against the British interest. Well, that's gone a very long time ago. And even in the limited remaining areas where national vetoes are retained, it doesn't deal with another problem. One government or parliament can agree to an EU law or a treaty provision, but a future parliament can't escape from it, can't change it, however the British people vote in subsequent elections. We are tied and shackled to an ever-growing mass of EU laws and rules which are in practice unreformable. But, of course, it is said, and was effectively said by Dominic, we have to accept all these laws and rules in order to trade with the EU. In order to trade with other countries, you need to accept limitations on your sovereignty. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper, as the saying goes. Rules against discriminating against imported goods and services, for example, are a normal part of international trade agreements. But EU law goes far beyond that. It spreads out well beyond trade-related matters, and it intrudes into and regulates vast areas of policy which have nothing at all to do with trade with other member states. And Dominic has been the victim of that. His decision to withhold the publication of Prince Charles' letters when he was Attorney General was quashed. Partly it was quashed on domestic law grounds, but it was also quashed on the ground that insofar as his letters contained environmental information, then withholding them from publication was contrary to the Environmental Services Directive. Where have we got to when EU law extends into that sort of matter? And as members of the audience, this audience will know, EU law has direct effect and primacy over national laws. It's interpreted by an activist court which looks at matters well beyond trade. And it said, in the well-known EEA agreement case, in its own words, the objective of all the community treaties is to contribute together to making concrete progress towards European unity. It follows from the foregoing that the provisions of the Rome Treaty on Free Movement and Competition, far from being an end in themselves, are only means for attaining those objectives. As the Court of Justice has consistently held, the community treaties established a new legal order for the benefit of which the states have limited their sovereign rights in ever wider fields, and the subjects of which comprise not only the member states, but also their nationals. No other group of trading nations in the world feels it necessary to adopt this kind of system of intrusive laws and overbearing courts in order to trade with each other. And so, by joining the EEC, which has become the EU, we have given up our birthright, the right of our people to govern ourselves through our elected representatives. But what is the mess of pottage for which we gave it up? And in fact, the supposed trade and economic benefits belonging to the EU have got less and less over time, as the cost to our democracy of the cancerous growth of EU law has gone up and up. The percent, and what Dominic mentioned, that 45% of our export trade is to other members of the European Union. What he didn't say is that that is in long-term decline. In 1999, 55% of our exports went to the EU. By 2015, it had dropped to well under half to 44%. It's still declining. This speaks volumes for the supposed benefits of the single market. If it's really so great to belong to it, why do we find it more difficult to grow our exports to the EU than to the rest of the world? And in fact, of all the member states of the European Union, we are this country that has the least amount of trade with other member states and the largest amount of trade with the rest of the world. So we have to ask how being in the European Union benefits or disadvantages our trade with the rest of the world. And again, contrary to what Dominic has told you, the European Union has been absolutely terrible in fashioning trade agreements with third countries. We're not allowed to make our own agreements because we're constrained by being in the European Union, customs union, from doing that. The European Union claims to have 50+ free trade deals. In fact, the overwhelming majority of those are either with developing countries in Eastern or Southern Europe or Mediterranean or micro-states like Caribbean islands. Now, those are worthwhile having. They're not key export markets for our country. The EU has done very few deals with major export markets, and for very good reason. There's a concluded but unratified trade deal with Canada. But that has now been thrown into doubt by the refusal of Romania and the Belgian region of Wallonia to ratify it. The EU is trying to negotiate a free trade deal with the South American trade bloc, Mercosur. But that has now been set back and thrown into doubt because France and 12 other member states object to it because concluding it would expose their agricultural sector to competition. The attempts to create a TTIP deal with the USA have been bedeviled by one important matter. The French insist on maintaining protectionist quotas for the French film industry. This causes quite a spanner in the works when Hollywood is one of the United States' major export industries. And this kind of thing makes it incredibly difficult for the European Union to be successful in negotiating trade deals. And it's argued, oh, we're too small to be successful on the world stage ourselves. Well, there are a lot of independent countries who are a lot smaller than us, both economically and in terms of population. Let's consider this. We are the 5th largest economy on the planet. We're one of the 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. We have the world's 4th largest military budget. We have the world's leading financial centre in the city, and we use the world's most widely used and learned language. And how much bigger do we have to be before we can prosper under our own laws and our own democracy.